start here. What I'm going to do is talk about a non-Thomist and an economist, but somebody who has actually contributed something I think fairly relevant for our part of history. And so if I'm not sort of getting tarred and feathered already, I'll continue. The chap is a man by the name of Thomas Gresham, and he's given the world what is these days referred to as Gresham's Law. And I find Gresham's Law a fascinating thing, and that's what I want to talk about. In fact, the extension of Gresham's Law, which is a nice economics law, you're going to be really interested in that, aren't you? You know, and people will find out a little bit further on that, you know, I'm particularly interested in the economics of properties. They're going to ask me what the Sydney property market's going to go. Right, so yeah, bear with us. We'll have a talk about that sort of afterwards if you really want to. But Gresham. Now, not only was he not a Thomist and he was an economist, he was also ended up being one of the richest men in England and an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. Makes him just about the kind of person that a Catholic wouldn't want to have anything to do with. And that's what I'm going to be talking about, Gresham's Law and philosophy. Gresham was a financier, and any of you who know me particularly well know that one of my favourite topics, and it's only when you give me an hour or two to talk here, I'll talk about usury. But it's probably one of the biggest problems in our world today. Gresham is probably a masterful usurer. He was born, I think, in 1517. So that was before King Henry wanted to do away with his wife. Henry VIII was the first political leader to legalise a rate of interest in over 1,000 years. For about 1,000 years, up until the era of the Protestant Revolt, charging interest on a money loan was considered to be both immoral and it was illegal. Henry VIII changed that. It's one of his minor innovations. Anyway, Gresham sort of came in and made a lot of money out of that, and he sort of helped the English crown make an awful lot of money, so he was very, very popular. And he actually didn't give us this law. This is one of the other curiosities about the English. I don't offend anyone with sort of deep English roots. My forebears are Irish and Scottish, you see, and so the original John Small didn't exactly come to Australia kind of under his own steam or because of his own decisions, right? And so on occasions, if you scratch me too deep, you'll find that I'm a bit racist. I don't like a lot of things in our Anglo history. But anyway, Gresham was there making an awful lot of money, and he sorted out the English financial situation, made them a lot of money. And one of the things that was a problem back then was that there's always a temptation in economies, and we're seeing a bit today, to introduce cheap money, to devalue, I guess is the expression we'd use, and economists use it a lot. Back in those days, if you had a coin, a gold coin or a silver coin or something, it would be made of gold or silver. Today, we would have what someone in Gresham's time would think of as denatured money, devalued money. It looked like silver, but it was in fact some sort of rubbishy cheap metal with maybe a little bit of silver in it to give it a little bit of a sparkle. Right? And they're progressively introducing more and more of what we call base metals into the silver coin. So instead of being a silver coin worth that weight of silver, it was now something else. It was denatured, devalued money. Okay? And this has been the undoings of many countries at different times. Curiously, it was the undoing of Nero, or one of his undoings. And one of the achievements of Constantine, apart from introducing Catholicism into the Roman Empire, was actually to go back to real money. Constantine minted for the first time a solid gold coin, first time in a long time for the Romans, and actually sorted out their economy. His name for the solid gold coin was a solidus. And our name shilling actually is derived indirectly from the Latin solidus. So this problem with currency is an old problem. In Thomas Gresham's time, it was an issue as well. There was a temptation for the king, the crown, to make money which wasn't quite as valuable as it appeared to be. That would work within the economy, and oddly enough, when you do that, a government is actually able to stimulate a lot of economic growth. Always a very prosperous time when you denature or devalue your currency. Now, I'm getting into technical economic stuff here. The only problem is, when you do it, the problem is that eventually you get found out. In the Roman time, the difficulty was, this is sort of around Nero and Constantine, that nobody else would buy things with Roman coinage apart from the Romans, right? Because if you wanted to go over and buy something, you know, from the Middle East or what have you, just on the other side of the border, someone would look at your Roman coin and say, oh, well, that's worth such and such, a denarii or whatever the denominations were, and the Arab or the whoever it was, African, would say, no, there's not enough gold in that to, you know, be worth sort of as a doorstop. Right? And so your economy actually sort of runs aground eventually. And that's the problem. It hurt the Romans, it hurt the French after the French Revolution, it was hurting the English, and there are a number of times when there's devaluation. And I think it's something which is actually happening in our economy today, but this is not the topic of what I'm talking about. Gresham came up with a very practical sort of English observation, and his Gresham's Law is very simply, bad money drives out good. Okay? So you've got two types of money, both circulating around the place. If you go down the street and you've got sort of some solid gold coins in one pocket and some, you know, cheap tinny ones in the other, okay, the government might be sort of, you know, thinking that they're wonderful at fiscal policy or monetary policy or what have you by minting all this extra money and be able to spend, and it's a great stimulus for the economy. But eventually what will happen is that if I go down the street and at a point where I can spend the cheap money in my one pocket for the value of the gold in the other, I'm going to keep the gold, right? Because I know that eventually there's going to be what we'd call today inflation, right? And so what would happen is that the gold all gets hidden away, and then the government has to mint more of these cheaper coins, and they want more again, and for a whole lot of reasons they keep on doing it, and the currency gets debased and so on. And so Gresham noticed this, and we get this expression, bad money drives out good. And we use it a lot in economics. I actually don't want to talk about economics tonight. That was just a little bit of a sweetener, right? Okay. And this is about where I actually kind of leave this behind. Gresham wasn't the first person to notice this. There's a whole armful of people that had noticed it before, and as I was just mentioning Constantine is simply one example. It's one of those practical things. It's real. You know, it's got to do with what's really going on. If you have pretend something which doesn't have reality behind it, then eventually a society won't be able to function, and that's the way it works in the economy. I would like to add to Gresham's Law an extra, a corollary. I would call it Small's corollary, and it goes like this. Whenever you lower a standard, like make the money cheaper, you get a short-term gain, but a long-term and usually permanent cost. And we've seen that in what I've been talking about with these currency things. The government is able to stimulate the economy with the cheap money, and so everyone gets really excited, and we have parties, and people, you know, buy new shoes and whatever else they're going to buy. But in the long term, the whole show kind of goes off the rails, and that's what we've found historically when we look at the history of of economic behaviour. Whenever this devaluation happens, eventually the economy falls apart. The global financial crisis was it sort of 10, 12 years ago, whenever it was, is an example of that kind of what we call a correction. Okay, the long term is a bit problematic. Short-term gain, long-term cost. And that's really what I want us to think about tonight. Applying Gresham's law, bad money drives out good, to lots of other places where lowering a standard, right, produces something which is very attractive, but eventually causes, some particular set of wheels to fall off. Right? And I think you can start to see how that works. I don't want to jump straight into its applications in philosophy just yet, but I want you to just think about the mechanism that's going on. Whenever there are two standards, two systems, whatever they are, whether it's money, whether it's something else, that are both considered to be good, acceptable, right? What will happen is that the community generally will gravitate towards the lower standard. And that's something that we're seeing all over the place. And that's really what I want us to think about. But we cannot have two different standards supposedly giving us the same result. I guess that's the real problem. I want to look at some applications. Now, I'm an economist, so I kind of find it hard to get away from economic examples. So bear with me while I talk about one which has not exactly got to do with money, it's actually got to do with land. Okay? I look out my backyard, and you know how sort of in a lot of houses around Sydney you can sort of see into your neighbour's kind of backyard. Now, I don't do it because, I've got sort of some sort of weird inclinations or what have you. But one of the things that I've noticed 2 or 3 years ago, it might have been 4 or 5 years ago, time gets away when you're old, in that nice backyard, they built a granny flat. And they fenced it all off. And now I don't think the owner of that property actually lives in either of the dwellings that's there. But now he's got 2 rents for the price of 1. Now I think the owner is probably very happy about that because he's got 1 block of land, he's collecting 2 rents, and so he's doing really well. He's got a benefit. Right? And anyone in here who's got a house, a nice little cottage with a backyard can actually do that. My son, very entrepreneurial, got himself married a couple of years ago, bought himself a nice house, and I thought that's really nice. He's going to have a backyard to go and, for his kids to run around with when they turn up. And guess what? He's just finished building a granny flat in his backyard because he wants to get rid of his mortgage faster and all that sort of thing. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, I can understand you doing that, but it'll earn you a quid or two. But where are your kids going to run around? And I think he's pretty keen about this idea of having children, so it's all nice. But the short-term gain of having the granny flat in the backyard means that it's going to be a lot less people are going to be able to afford to have a place for their kids to run around in future. Even worse, and again, this is me putting on my economics hat, when word gets out that you're getting 2 rents on 1 block of land, what's that going to do to the price of housing? People are going to think, oh, well, I can pay more for that block of land because it's going to earn me this extra income. So the price of houses is going to go up. So being able to put the granny flat in the backyard, while it's sort of nice if you really got a granny to go and put in the backyard, right? But if you're doing it simply because you want to make some extra money, it's actually going to help to make houses with backyards more unaffordable or less affordable for people that actually want to do with backyards what you're supposed to do with them, which is have a family. Right? Gresham's Law. Short-term gain, long-term, virtually permanent cost. Right? The community is worse off as a result of having granny flats. Most people may not sort of notice that at first, but when you think about it, it becomes really obvious. I think I may have said in this forum, I went through a period a few years ago saying just about anywhere that people were silly enough to let me talk in public, that I think the reason that houses are unaffordable, or dwellings are unaffordable in most of the West, most of the Anglo world certainly, is because of the pill. Why is that? Because in 1970, when the pill was a bit of a novelty and not very many Catholics used it, a family could only afford to pay for a house what the husband could earn, or what was left over what he earned after he sort of paid for all the bills. Right? By the time you get to 1980, 10 years later, a family could afford to pay for a house the price that could be supported or paid back by mum and dad both working and hardly having any kids. Very, very sort of powerful incentive for the prices to go up. And I can sort of show that with lots of graphs and all the things that economists do. Okay, short-term gain, long-term permanent cost. And so we can see Gresham's law being applied to land and to houses. Okay? To a certain extent, the pill itself is an example of that sort of thing. And right now we're moving into the era in our culture where we're moving into having to pay for the short-term benefit that was enjoyed by people in the 70s and 80s and maybe more recently by not having children. Okay? Our whole society has been calibrated to sterility. Short-term gain, long-term cost. What we're seeing in Europe, again, the European winter, it was a result of that same process happening in the same period that is now sort of settled in, and we might complain about the cultural changes that are happening in Europe and all the rest of it. But it's largely because the Europeans were enjoying a merry old time through the 70s and 80s when they should have been investing more in their children than in their, second houses and their retirement schemes and all the other things they're doing, rather than having families. Family is a very ordinary, natural thing to have when you're married. It takes an awful lot of work and a fair bit of science and fooling about to avoid it. But it's now become almost a necessity, apart from people that are heroic enough to actually swim against the tide. Okay, that's an example of Gresham's law. Probably jumping the gun a little bit because I want to talk about bad morals driving out good a little bit later. But I want to, first of all, just talk in general about philosophy, because we know that morals is a part of philosophy in general. In order to have the bad morals that have driven out the good morals, we have to have a general philosophical framework which has also lost its sense, its goodness. Okay? I'm a bit of a stickler, and I think most of the people here, so I'm preaching the converted, are relatively comfortable with something which is often referred to as moderate realism or classical realism, or something with the word realism in it, because it's a system of philosophy which is based on reality. Now, what could be more straightforward than that? And if you wanted to have a common sense kind of, thinking about thought and all the other things that philosophy is all about, my goodness, isn't it pretty obvious it has to do with reality? Right? And yet good philosophy has been driven out by bad philosophy. Now, that was a process that was starting roughly around the time of Gresham. It really started probably a little bit earlier, and a lot of people like to pick on poor old René Descartes. I prefer to level my sights at Machiavelli, but, yeah, Duns Scotus. And John Wycliffe, I think, for my money, is probably the beginning, or one of the thought leaders.
Well, so was Scotus.
Well, you're proving my case, Yeah. No. But bad philosophy. It was considered to be equivalent. It's just an alternative. This is new thinking and all the rest of it. And invariably what you find is that when you get some new philosophy coming in, invariably it is a lowering of the standards. It's a lot easier. I had to, for my sins, I had to study, what was his name? David Hume. The supposedly great British philosopher, the father of modern philosophy, or at least British empiricism. Crikey. You watch these absolutely, very, very intelligent professors, as over at Sydney Uni, trying to basically prove that black was white. David Hume, you guys are probably aware of this, when he's writing his philosophy, he's saying, well, I sit in my study and I really, when I'm doing philosophy, I can't be sure that my maid exists, but I find it far more convenient to believe in her when she brings in the tea. And Crikey, how can you organise anything? How can you get the water to run out of the taps if your philosophy doesn't even believe that there's water there, really? Right? You have to take off your philosopher's hat in order to be a plumber or to be an electrician or to take out the garbage or whatever it is, right? Bad philosophy drives out good. And I think I don't know if modern philosophy has a metaphysics, but if it does, and I remember when I first met Peter, it was because I was trying to make sense of how to approach my studies to get through a modern philosophy exam in metaphysics. And I got to the end of it, and I thought, this is, people say that philosophy is crazy, and I was just lining up to do this exam, right? And someone said, you ought to go along to the Centre for Thomistic Studies. And so I went along, and I met a whole lot of really wonderful people, and some of them are in this room. That's really great. And all of a sudden, metaphysics started to make sense. It was common sense. It was real, right? And I had to go back and sit through this exam, and I was able to do it, and I don't know, I got a credit or something. But the whole thing about it, though, was that modern metaphysics is just an awful lot of confusion and whatever. You need bad metaphysics to drive out the good metaphysics, because you need bad metaphysics to kind of subvert your moral philosophy, I think. And I think you've got bad metaphysics that's driven out the good metaphysics. You've got bad logic. I was studying philosophy over at Sydney University. For some reason, I went back and did a second undergraduate degree, and one of my subjects, my third major, was sociology, and it was really quite weird because I had to read an awful lot of feminist theory, right? And the really interesting thing about reading feminist theory, and I've forgotten most of it now because I am getting a bit old and silly, but was feminists were making a really big thing about their logic. I don't want to offend sort of half the people in the room, but there's something very weird about feminist logic. At least the kind of feminist logic that you meet in sociology. I have a great fondness for ladies, but feminist logic is just it's off with the fairies. It's crikey. That's probably quite true. There you go. Modern philosophy, bad philosophy drives out good. Short-term benefit, because it really facilitated a lot of convenience for a lot of people. I would say that the bad metaphysics enabled Henry VIII to justify this, changing the laws on usury. And to a certain extent, I think it has a lot to do with the Protestant revolt. Short-term benefit, so people were able to muck up and do whatever they wanted. Long-term cost. Now that leads on to bad morals driving out good. And we've already been talking about that to a certain extent. If we can say you are a good person by, doing all of the things that Catholics used to do, abstain on Fridays and go to Mass on Sundays and all that sort of stuff, but you can also be a good person by not having to bother about all that sort of stuff, right? So I'm a good person. Some people say I'm a good person if I go to Mass on Sundays, and other people say you're a good person just because you're a good person, because something else. Because you're nice. You don't sort of step on the cat's tail or something, right? And that becomes important. And I think you see that with the environmental movement. I think the greatest contribution to our culture, if it's a contribution, of the environmental movement is its capacity to provide an alternate moral system. Somebody feels good because they've recycled their toilet paper. Doesn't really matter if they're having abortions and sort of murdering people and doing all sorts of stuff. But, I went out with a bucket and sort of caught a bit of rainwater and sort of used that to, do some useful thing. Oddly enough, you get this sort of the council people coming along and saying you're actually not supposed to drink sort of water that falls on the roof of your house. But the thing about the environmental movement is that if I'm an environmentalist, I get to say, you weird and wacky bad people, you're having children. You dreadful people, you're driving around in motor cars. You bad people, you're not having abortions. Right? It's an alternate moral system. I can feel good being an environmentalist. Right? And one of the things I used to tell my students, one of the curious bits of logic, pick up, you guys are sort of interested in this, pick up any book on any major environmental problem. Climate change these days tends to take the cake most of the time. Go towards the back of the book and you'll find that in any, regardless of what the environmental problem is, one of the solutions will always be population control. Isn't that curious? It solves all of the problems. Right? But you see, it belongs to an alternate moral system. And ultimately, that moral system is either capable of supporting a culture or it is not. I would say it's not. It's going to be a long-term cost. And we're further on, and probably sort of over a glass of wine or something later on, people will say, oh, you know, what do you think the world's going on? Or at least our culture. It's pretty hard to see it doing anything more than what the Roman culture was doing at the time of St. Benedict. And that's a one-way street. The Romans have never come back. They make really nice motor cars, but as a world power, they don't cut it, right? And it's taken them 2,000 years, 2,000 years, or 1,500 years later, they're still not a world power. The Indians had a pretty awesome culture going. When their culture fell off the perch, so to speak, the Indians are able to do their call centres and do a lot of other good things, but as a world power, hardly likely, right? We talk about the Greeks. Absolutely awesome world power at one stage. Alexander was kind of marching through the world, picking up countries here, there and everywhere. Have the Greeks ever come back? No. Romans? No. Chinese? Well, they've kind of actually done it through change into communism and all the rest of it. But you find that as just one of those curious things about history. When a culture loses its moral underpinnings, it tends to walk off the stage of history with a one-way ticket. Okay. I would say that's fundamentally about the bad moral system displacing the good. Gresham's law applied to morals. I would say also we can apply Gresham's law to religion. Okay? It's a little bit of a delicate one. We've largely been taught, I think, at least in the public discourse within the Catholic Church, that there's more than one religion that will get you to heaven. Some people would say that non-Catholic religions are vehicles of grace. Right? The things that are going to take you to achieve salvation. The Catholic Church used to teach, and I think it still does, that there is only one way to salvation. There is no salvation outside the church. Now, when I first started coming across that idea in the last 20 years or so, I had to work through an awful lot of programming that had taught me something quite different. And I can remember the first time I was starting to hear these really weird sort of extreme Catholics saying no salvation outside the church. What's the point of all that? Everyone knows that's not true. Right? But what does it mean if there are other religions which can achieve salvation? Right? In a Catholic religion, I have to go to confession if I do something, a bit naughty. I have to go to Mass on Sunday. I have to do a lot of inconvenient things. But if I can go to heaven by simply being a nice person, or maybe darkening the door of my church, for baptisms, weddings and funerals, maybe at Christmas every now and then if I feel really sort of spiritual, right? And I still get to heaven, doesn't that really establish two different standards? I remember once hearing a Catholic priest actually talk about the way that, all religions, or at least an awful lot of them, lead you to heaven. And this is at my parish church. This is a long time ago, maybe 30 years ago. Doesn't make sense. And I asked him a question. Now, this was because I was really naive and dumb, you see. I said, that doesn't make sense. And the priest said, da-di-da-di-da, and all the rest of it, and he just rattled off some kind of pat kind of thing, and it all sounded very intellectual, but it was wrong, right? And the worst thing is, this chap sitting next to me, and he had a collar on, so he was a pretty clerical gentleman, older man. And he says, oh, well, blah, 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 blah. And he started to proceed to explain to me the gobbledygook that this priest has been sort of spouting out. That I just couldn't make sense of it. And I was there trying to understand this because I was trying to be really enthusiastic. And it was I don't know, Wednesday night or what have you at my parish, and I got this talk on, how to be holier and theologically clever and all sort of carry on. And the fellow was saying something, and I was obviously an absolute theological Luddite because I just couldn't sort of, cope with what this fellow was doing. And so anyway, this clerical gentleman sit next to me, and I thought, maybe he's an Anglican, because he sort of, they kind of dress up like Catholics sometimes, and he seems to be sort of onto all this sort of stuff. And anyway, he proceeds to try and convince me. This is my ignorance, right? It was the Bishop of Parramatta. Now, he was a few bishops, Ray, and I think he's passed away, so, I shouldn't speak ill of the dead. But I don't think that in the episcopate he's probably alone these days. I hope this is not going on the internet. Bad religion drives out good. We have been taught for a long time that there are lots of Christian religions. We just happen to belong to one of them. I would say that the non-Catholic religions define themselves by their rejection of Christ and his church and the moral order of his church. And so if I was a member of a Protestant religion, say Gresham's religion, how do I define my religion? What makes my religion interesting? Well, yes, it's got a few bits and pieces from the religion that Christ, the Son of God, came to earth to found, but it defines itself on where it opposes that religion. It refers to it as popish nonsense in the case of the Anglicans, or many others as well. These days it seems that in certain quarters it's very non-PC to be critical of what Chesterton used to refer to as the Protestant religions. I could be wrong here, and someone can certainly point me to some place in Chesterton's writings, because I certainly haven't found it, where he talks about Protestant Christians. He talks about the church, and he talks about the Protestant religions. He was talking about that in orthodoxy before he was a Catholic, because he knew that there was only one standard for Christianity. There could not be two. And that was what was drawing him into the church that was founded by the Son of God. Now today, we seem to be comfortable with the idea that there are lots of Christian religions, and in fact even some non-Christian religions who seem to have a bit of a leg up, sort of some people are fond of the Buddhists and some of the Hindus and all the rest. In a lot of quarters, the poor old Muslims kind of get it in the neck, which is a bit of unfortunate in a way, because again, one of my favourites, my hero G.K. Chesterton and Belloc, they would have described the Muslims as no more than a Christian heresy. And I think there is an awful lot to defend that claim. If you look at the Islamic religion, it has plagiarised an awful lot from the Catholic Church. And we were talking earlier on and talking about the Arians, and it just seems that that's where they got off. And if you talk to somebody who is a zealous Muslim, certainly one that's gone a little bit studied, I would say you guys have gone wrong when you rejected Arius. So it's so we shouldn't be too hard on the poor old Muslims. Oddly enough, the Muslims get a fair bit of the moral law right. They get a certain amount of it wrong too. But certainly in the economic area, I actually teach Islamic economics. And I do it as a covert way of teaching Thomistic sound economics, because I think the Muslims stole it from us. Right. Okay, so what I've aimed to do tonight is not really give you a serious philosophical discourse, or I may have ended up straying into some controversial topics. But Gresham's Law, I think, is something which is worth remembering. And if you remember the name, you can sort of drop it at parties and all that sort of stuff. Oh, Gresham's Law, bad money drives out good. when the next financial crisis comes, and a lot of people would say it's not that far away, you can say, yes, well, that's because of the devaluing of our currency and our inflation and da-di-da-di-da, and a lot of other things. Gresham Law, I think, applies to the way that we've, taken apart our manufacturing industry in Australia and a number of other things. But remember Gresham's Law, but also use it to look at the world in this wider area. Whenever somebody is trying to trick you into believing that there are two standards that are both okay, say, Gresham's Law, if we accept that rubbish, whatever it is that we're dealing with, whether it's real estate, whether it's money, whether it's the Holy Catholic Church, whatever it is, you know you're in something that eventually is going to destroy the thing which is supposed to be improving. Okay, thank you.